What's the one thing you'd say to your younger self before your first betrayal?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Yesterday, I washed the dishes at my parents' barbecue, said nothing, and walked away without a goodbye, and by evening my sister was texting me that mom was in tears and refusing to speak. To everyone else it might sound like a small thing, but for me it was the day I stopped being useful, the day I stopped playing the role they had quietly written for me. The barbecue wasn't some rare family gathering, it was the same pattern that has been running for years. My parents invited everyone over under the excuse of a family cookout, but in reality it was another staged celebration of Lauren's so-called success. She got the new promotion, she got the new car, she got a round of applause for simply existing in the way my parents wanted, while I carried plates, refilled drinks, and tried to avoid the tight knot in my chest that formed every time they spoke about her as if she were the only daughter they had. I sat there at the table, half listening as Dad bragged about how Lauren had been recognized at work for leading a major initiative, while Mom cut him off to add how proud she was of Lauren's grace under pressure. None of them even glanced my way, and I realized I had become nothing but the silent background worker who kept the event moving. I collected plates before anyone asked, carried them to the sink, and turned back only to see another round of laughter about Lauren's bright future. I had achievements of my own, ones I knew mattered, but they had never been counted as worthy. Paying Mom's hospital bill when insurance denied coverage, covering part of Dad's car repair when his card was maxed, stepping in to take Lauren's kids when her sitter canceled, none of that was worth a mention. It was invisible labor, and I had been stupid enough to believe it was love. That day I realized silence had been my biggest mistake. Every time I avoided confrontation, every time I told myself they would notice eventually, I only reinforced the story that I was there to serve, not to shine. As I stood at the sink rinsing dishes, I felt this surge of anger, not the loud kind, but the steady one that makes your hands stop shaking and your head go clear. I stacked the plates, slid the last glass into the dishwasher, and without planning it, I did something that even surprised me. I opened the cabinet above the sink where I had hidden a simple manila folder weeks earlier, the one filled with receipts, Venmo screenshots, and statements I had printed out when I first felt my patience running thin. I placed it inside the empty dishwasher before closing the door. The folder was labeled with one word: support. Inside were copies of every time I had bailed them out, every bill paid, every transfer, every small favor that turned into real money and real time. 2 years of evidence that while they clapped for Lauren, I had been the one keeping the lights on, sometimes literally. I knew Dad would eventually run the dishwasher before bed, and when he did, that folder would land right in his hands. No dramatic confrontation, no screaming scene at the barbecue, just quiet, factual truth delivered in the most ordinary place possible, the machine that cleaned the dishes I was always expected to handle. When I picked up my keys and walked out of the house, nobody noticed. That was the point. I drove home in silence, but for the first time it wasn't the silence of being ignored, it was the silence of planning. I didn't call, I didn't text, I didn't leave an explanation. All I did was send Dad a one-line message from the driveway: run the dishwasher before bed. That was all I needed to say. By evening my phone buzzed, and it wasn't Dad, it was Lauren. Her message was short: Mom is in tears and won't talk. What happened? I stared at it for a long time, and then I typed back 3 words that shifted everything. Ask her who. I didn't need to say more. If Mom was finally crying, it wasn't because I made a scene. It was because, for the first time, she couldn't control the narrative. For once, the truth was louder than her voice. And that was only the beginning. The group chat woke me up before the alarm because Mom had decided to convert embarrassment into a public service announcement for the family, dressing it up as a soft, careful message about misunderstandings and hurt feelings. And even though her wording looked gentle on the surface, I could hear the same old subtext that had been humming under every conversation for years, the one where I am asked to be calm, to be generous, to be the bigger person who absorbs the impact so that the show can go on uninterrupted. And for a few minutes I lay there reading the thread as cousins added harmless stickers and Lauren posted a vague heart. And I realized with a kind of relief that the part of me that used to panic was quiet now because the work had already begun without a speech from me. I typed a single long message that did not accuse or beg or circle around the point, and in it I said that the unpaid job I had been performing was officially over and that I would no longer be the emergency sitter, the late-night driver, the bookkeeper who fixes auto-pay disasters, the person who waits on hold with insurance for an hour while someone else makes dinner plans, or the silent cleaner who resets the room before the photos. And I listed each role as if it were a line on a resume, with dates and examples, not to humiliate anyone, but to make visible what had been treated as air. And at the bottom, I wrote one clear sentence that landed with more force than any rant I could have delivered. At the grill, from this day forward, there will be no labor without credit, no access without notice, and no emergencies that are secretly avoidable being handed to me like a baton in a race I never agreed to run. I added a second message that was half humor and half audit, a tidy summary of the hours I had spent in the past year doing pickups and drop-offs and grocery runs and errand relays that magically freed up other people's time. And I framed it as an invoice that required no payment because I was closing the account forever, a little ceremonial document that allowed me to mark the account status as paid in full by me and permanently shut. And even though I kept my tone light, I could feel the room change, because it is hard to argue with a list that has dates and places and descriptions that everyone recognizes as real, and silence began to pool under the thread like water under a closed door. Lauren tried to shift the focus to tone by suggesting that my words felt sharp and that I could have asked for appreciation in a kinder way, but I have learned that when someone critiques your tone after ignoring your work, what they are really saying is that the content is correct and the correction makes them uncomfortable. So I answered once, very clearly, that new policies were in effect and that I would not be discussing my delivery while my delivery had been the only thing they measured for years, and I left it there. Aunt Renee, who has the small but powerful habit of remembering reality, posted a short line that cut through the nervous noise. And she said that she remembered the morning I was in the hospital waiting room before sunrise, and that she remembered who else was not there, and even though she did not name anyone. The message landed like a bell because it reminded the family that witnesses exist and that private myths do not erase public facts, and after she sent it, the thread slowed to a trickle, which I took as a sign that the engine had finally stalled. I spent a few minutes unsubscribing myself from the micro-obligations that get mistaken for kindness, removed my name from the meal train spreadsheet that always seemed to assign me the days no one wanted, rejected the calendar invite that labeled me as backup for school pickup for a month I had never agreed to cover, and wrote a short, clean email to the church coordinator thanking her for the chance to help and explaining that I would be stepping back for personal reasons, which is the polite translation of I will not be supplying free labor for people who refuse to see me. When Mom called, she did not ask what I needed or even what hurt. She asked for an apology for the way I had handled things, which told me everything I needed to know about how quickly the old rules wanted to reassert themselves. And I said that I would not apologize for paying bills or for making sure the lights stayed on or for choosing documentation over drama, because if the facts were painful, then the pain belonged to the facts, not to the person who finally put them in order. She sighed the sigh I know from childhood, the one that means she is both resentful and worried about appearances, and she said that people were asking questions, and I said that questions are what you get when the answers have been made up. And I kept my voice even because I did not want to fight, I wanted a contract. After I hung up, Dad called from the garage, which is where he goes when he wants to sound neutral and safe. And he lowered his voice like we were sharing a secret and told me that my name was on something important and that we needed to talk before Mom started moving pieces around to solve the problem without really solving it. And while he spoke, I heard the faint scrape of the stool he uses when he polishes tools, which always means he is anxious. He asked me to come by in the evening, and I said I would if the conversation could be straightforward and if it could be about responsibility rather than damage control. And he said yes, with a kind of relief that made me think he had been waiting for this shift for longer than he would ever admit. Before I left for work, I wrote one last message in the family thread that would either be received as arrogant or as freeing, and I could not care which way it landed anymore, and I said that I wished everyone well and that my life would be operating on notice. credit and reciprocity, and that if anyone needed help they could ask with time to plan and with honesty about what they had already tried, and that if the answer was no, it would not be a punishment, it would be a boundary. And then I put my phone face down and felt something I had not felt since I was a teenager with my first apartment key, that electric little click of the lock turning from the inside. By late afternoon, Lauren sent me a private message with a link and a screenshot of a nomination from a local nonprofit for an award recognizing outstanding family support. And the citation named her personally for sustained behind-the-scenes assistance during a difficult period for our parents, and the dates in the write-up matched my receipts down to the week. And under the screenshot, she wrote a single question that was less a question than a challenge, asking whether I had done this to her. I kept my reply short not because I wanted to be cruel, but because adding explanation would drag me back into the swamp where stories expand to swallow proof, and I wrote that I had corrected the record. And then I put the phone down again because the point had never been to humiliate her on a stage. It had been to stop financing a story that erased me. Dad called once more as the sun went down, and his voice had that careful edge that tells me Mom is in the next room, and he asked me to come over because he believed there was a card or an account or some kind of paperwork that would affect more than a nomination. And he said that my name was still listed in a place that made me more responsible than anyone realized, and I said I would come, because if there was a lever in the house with my name on it, I wanted my hand on it before anyone else tried to pull. When I pulled into my parents' driveway that evening, the garage door was already half open, which was always Dad's way of signaling that he wanted to talk without Mom overhearing. And the second I stepped inside, I saw the small pile of envelopes on his workbench that had my name printed across the top in bold letters, proof of something I had almost forgotten. Something I had created years ago when they were drowning in late fees and high interest rates, thinking I was helping, not realizing I was quietly writing myself into legal obligations that would one day give me leverage I never intended to have. Years back, when Dad's credit had been damaged by a loan he co-signed for a friend, I had opened an emergency card in my name because my score was stronger, adding both him and Mom as authorized users, telling myself that it was temporary, that it was just until they stabilized, and then I had paid it down each month, covering the gaps with my own money whenever they couldn't. Never once asking for a thank you, believing the story that family loyalty didn't need credit. Now, standing there in the garage, Dad admitted that he had never told Mom the full details, and while he spoke, he kept glancing at the envelopes as if they were about to shout my secrets aloud. And finally, he said that the account had been used more recently than he realized, not just for groceries or gas, but for things that had nothing to do with survival. There were salon charges, airfare for Lauren's work trip, a catering deposit that matched the barbecue menu almost exactly, and a list of smaller indulgences that had somehow been coded as family needs. He said Mom assumed the card was theirs, that it was some joint lifeline, and when I asked him directly whether Lauren knew whose name carried the actual weight, he hesitated long enough to give me the answer. She knew, and she used it anyway, confident that her reputation as the successful daughter would never be dented by the technical truth of who signed the account and who made the payments. I felt an odd mixture of fury and relief, because suddenly the invisible work had a paper trail stronger than any argument I could make, and I realized that by being the responsible one, I had unwittingly built a lever that gave me the ability to stop the cycle cleanly. Without another word, I took out my phone right there on the workbench, called the bank, and within minutes had removed both of my parents as authorized users, froze any future charges, and asked for a final statement to be mailed directly to me. When the representative confirmed the changes, I felt something inside me loosen, as if a chain had been unclipped, because for the first time in years no one else could spend under my name. Dad watched quietly, rubbing the handle of a wrench like it was a prayer bead, and when I ended the call he only said, "She's going to be furious." I told him that fury was cheaper than fraud, and I walked back into the night knowing that I had just cut the fuel line to the entire story. They had been running. The next morning, before work, I sat down at my computer and went further. I logged into Mom's health portal where I had been listed for years as the primary contact, the one who fielded billing questions, prescription refills, and scheduling conflicts whenever she couldn't be bothered, and I removed myself. I left her a voicemail saying that from now on she and Dad would need to manage their own accounts, that I would not be the default middleman anymore, and that if she found this cold, she should remember how many times I had done this work in silence. Then I called Lauren's daycare, the one where I was listed as an emergency backup pickup, and politely told them to remove my name as well. By lunchtime, every system that had relied on my reliability was redirected back to its rightful owner, and though I knew it would cause chaos, I felt calmer than I had in years because the chaos was finally theirs to solve. That evening Lauren messaged me again, this time with more bite than curiosity. She sent a screenshot of an email from the nonprofit that had nominated her for the award, the one recognizing outstanding family support, and the wording praised her for being the anchor during medical and financial hardships. The dates matched the very receipts I had shown Dad in the folder, and it was as if someone had taken my life and handed it to her wrapped in applause. Her message was short but sharp. "Did you do this to me?" I stared at it, and for the first time I didn't feel the urge to explain or soften or try to keep the peace. I typed 3 words. I corrected it. Those words hung there between us like a gavel strike, and within minutes she sent a flurry of follow-ups, accusing me of being petty, vindictive, jealous, all the tired labels she had used since we were kids whenever I stopped smoothing the edges for her. I put my phone down and let her rage. The point was not to convince her. The point was to stop underwriting a lie that had defined my role in the family for too long. Later that night, Dad called again, his voice even lower than before, telling me that Mom was unraveling because the story she had built about Lauren's selflessness was being challenged not with shouting, but with documented proof. And he said that I had better prepare myself, because Mom was already planning how to spin this. He warned me that my name was still tied to more things than I realized, and that I needed to decide quickly whether I was going to keep untangling myself quietly or whether I was ready to let everyone see just how deep my involvement had been. I told him I was done waiting for permission. I had already removed the users, closed the doorways, and cut the cords. Whatever leverage I had left, I was going to use it, not for revenge in the way people imagine, but for something sharper, something cleaner, a reset of every single rule that had kept me invisible. And as I hung up, I knew the next move would not just change the family dynamic, it would crack the public version of who we were wide open. The nonprofit event was scheduled for the following week, and even though I had no intention of attending in person, I knew it would become a turning point because the award nomination that had been written with Lauren's name on it had been built entirely on my work, my sacrifices, and my time, and there was no way I was going to let that narrative stand without a correction. I drafted a careful message to the committee, attaching copies of receipts, bank transfers, and even a log of hospital visits that were time-stamped and irrefutable. I did not demand recognition or attempt to switch the spotlight to myself, because that would only feed the same machine that had erased me for years. Instead, I requested that the citation be amended to reflect anonymous support, or, if they insisted on crediting an individual, that they ensure accuracy by removing any implication that my sister had carried the burden. Within 24 hours they responded, polite but firm, letting me know that the program had been updated and that the award would no longer be linked to Lauren's name. They would thank an anonymous family supporter instead. It was exactly the outcome I wanted. Not applause, not a stage, but the removal of a lie. On the night of the ceremony, Lauren stood on that stage under the assumption that the spotlight was still hers, and when the presenter announced that the award was being given to an anonymous donor who provided ongoing financial and practical support, I could imagine the split second where her smile faltered and the air went heavy. Her boss was in the audience, coworkers were scattered through the crowd, and the story she had rehearsed in her head fell apart in public silence. That moment alone was enough for me, because it forced the truth to exist outside of private family arguments. It lived now in a record that no one could undo, no matter how many explanations Mom tried to craft afterward. The fallout was immediate. Mom called me as soon as she got home, and her voice was sharp with the kind of anger that is less about betrayal and more about lost control. She accused me of embarrassing the family, of humiliating Lauren, of dragging private matters into the open, and she used every guilt-wrapped word she had perfected over decades to press me back into my old role. I let her finish, and then said one sentence that seemed to freeze her completely. I ended a lie. There was no room left for negotiation, no cracks for her to wedge another speech into, and I think she realized in that moment that she no longer had a script that worked on me. The next day, I executed a move that was both subtle and devastating. I created a shared photo album, private only to family, filled with images that had been sitting on my phone for years, pictures I had taken without intention of using them this way, but that now formed a silent archive of who had actually been present. There were photos of me in hospital waiting rooms at dawn with half-empty coffee cups, me standing in school hallways holding Lauren's kids' backpacks, me patching drywall in Dad's garage while he was away, and even me signing a check at the kitchen table with the memo line circled clearly. Each photo was date-stamped, unfiltered, and entirely ordinary, but together they formed a record more powerful than any speech I could have written. I titled the album "Who Showed Up" and shared the link with every relative in the group thread. I did not add captions, I did not offer explanations, I did not even include a message. The evidence spoke for itself. For hours no one responded, which was unusual in a family that thrived on constant chatter. Then Aunt Renee posted a single comment. "Well, this clears things up." Nothing more. That silence afterward told me that the myth had been cracked wide open and that my mother's attempts to spin the story into another lecture about family loyalty would never fully land again. You can argue with words, but you cannot argue with a photograph that places you exactly where you were not. That evening, when I checked my mailbox, there was an envelope I did not expect to find, addressed in handwriting I recognized immediately as Mom's, but older, shakier, as if it had been written years ago. Inside was a letter that had clearly been composed in a moment of guilt and never mailed. In it, she admitted that she leaned too heavily on me because I never pushed back, that she favored Lauren because it was easier to polish one child as the star than to face her own fear of being ordinary, and that she knew deep down she had created a system where I was the worker and Lauren was the ornament. She wrote that she wished she could change it, but that she did not know how, and then she had folded the letter neatly, tucked it away, and chosen to continue as if she had never confessed any of it. Holding that letter in my hands, I felt a strange combination of sorrow and vindication. Sorrow because it proved she had always known, and vindication because it meant my instincts had been right all along. I had not imagined the imbalance. I had not exaggerated the neglect. I had simply been living inside a story that everyone else benefited from while I carried the weight. That letter became my final piece of evidence, not for them but for me, proof that the imbalance was deliberate, maintained by silence, and chosen every single day. When Lauren texted me later that night demanding to know why I had humiliated her in front of her colleagues, I did not answer. I placed the letter on my desk, stared at it, and thought about how easy it had been for Mom to put the truth into writing only to hide it when it threatened her comfort. That choice defined the family more than any barbecue, more than any award, more than any speech. And now that the truth was out, I realized I had the final move still in my hands. The question was not whether I would use it, it was when, and in what way, because once I did, nothing in our family would ever be the same. The letter sat on my desk for 2 days before I decided what to do with it, and in those hours I kept circling back to the same realization, that my mother had written down the truth years ago. Admitted she had made me the reliable servant while polishing Lauren as the family's prize, and then deliberately folded that confession away to continue living the same lie. The anger I felt was different from the old bursts of frustration that used to fade after a night of sleep. This was slower, heavier, shaped by the knowledge that she could have chosen honesty at any point and instead had chosen comfort, appearances, and control. When I finally drove to the house again, I carried the letter in one hand and a printed document in the other, because I was done letting conversations dissolve into shouting or guilt. I wanted terms, clear and visible, so there would never again be confusion about who I was in this family and what I would accept. When I walked into the kitchen, Mom and Dad were seated at the table like they were waiting for a verdict, and Lauren was leaning against the counter with her arms folded, pretending she was there to mediate when really she was waiting to see if she still held any influence over the narrative. I placed the letter in the center of the table without a word and watched Mom's face as she recognized her own handwriting. She did not reach for it, perhaps afraid I would accuse her of hiding it, but she did not deny it either, and that silence was enough. Then I slid the second document across the table, a single-page list I had typed in plain font with 3 rules. First, no more comparisons between children, spoken or implied, because they had used that weapon to reduce me for decades. Second, no requests would be accepted without notice, credit, and reciprocity, which meant that if I was asked to contribute time or money, there would be acknowledgement and balance. Third, and most important, no rewriting of history would be tolerated, which meant that the work I had done in the past could not be assigned to anyone else to pad their image. I told them calmly that if they wanted me to remain part of the family, those were the terms. I explained that I was not asking for constant praise or dramatic recognition, just fairness and honesty, and that if they found these rules too harsh, then the choice was theirs, because I would no longer bend myself into a silent shadow just to keep the illusion intact. Dad read the page twice and nodded slowly, and I could tell that he understood, maybe even felt relieved, because part of him had been carrying guilt for years without the courage to name it. Mom, on the other hand, stared at the letter and then at the rules, and her hands shook slightly, not from age, but from the knowledge that her control had finally been broken. She tried to argue that family should not need contracts, that love should be enough, but I answered that love without respect is just dependency dressed up, and that I had spent enough years proving my love through labor while being erased from the story. Before I left, I added one final act that sealed everything in place. From my bag, I pulled out a copy of the updated beneficiary form for the small life insurance policy I had been paying for myself since my 20s, a policy I had once intended to split with Lauren in a gesture of fairness. The new form listed only my name, and I placed it on the table beside the rules. I looked directly at Mom and said, "I stopped financing my erasure." The words landed like a hammer because they stripped away the last illusion that I would continue to sacrifice without boundaries. I hugged Dad, told him I loved him, and then turned toward the door because I wanted my exit to be clear and decisive. By the time I reached the driveway, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Mom, just 5 words. I read the rules. "Stay." For a moment I stood there, car keys in hand, the house behind me filled with decades of imbalance, and I let the silence stretch. I typed back, "Only if we start over," and pressed send. Whether I walked back inside or drove away, I will leave unsaid, because the truth is that the victory had already been secured. For once the terms were mine, the story was no longer stolen, and the power had shifted to where it should have been all along. That night, for the first time in years, I felt no need to rehearse explanations or defend choices in my head. I had shown proof, set boundaries, corrected lies, and forced honesty out of people who had built comfort on my silence. Whatever came next would be on my conditions, not theirs, and that was the kind of justice I had been waiting for. Not loud or vengeful, but sharp, clean, and impossible to undo. I had turned the tables without shouting, without cruelty, without begging, and the brilliance of it was that they finally understood that the reliable one was also the one who could end the game.